My daughter thought she was marrying a good man. I knew better. I just couldn't prove it yet. My name is Frederick Caulfield. I'm 67 years old, retired from 32 years in commercial real estate, and I've spent most of my adult life being the kind of man who watches quietly and says little. My late wife Eleanor used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Fred, you see everything and say nothing, and one day that's going to drive me to an early grave." She passed 8 years ago, breast cancer, and not a single day goes by that I don't wish I could tell her she was right. My daughter Renata is 34. She has Eleanor's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that changes depending on the light, and Eleanor's laugh, the kind that fills a room before you've even heard the joke. She teaches 4th grade at a public school in Asheville, North Carolina. She drives a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked bumper and a backseat full of library books she's checked out for her students. She is, without question, the best person I know, and she is, also without question, the most trusting. She met him at a fundraiser for the school district. He was there representing some investment firm, he said. His name was Sutton, Callum Sutton, 38, dark-haired, easy smile. The kind of man who looks like he belongs on the cover of a catalog for expensive watches. He had a way of leaning in when he talked to you, making you feel like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. I noticed that immediately. I also noticed that his eyes, when they weren't aimed directly at whoever he was charming, went very still and very flat. Renata called me 2 weeks after they met. She said, "Dad, I think I really like this one." She hadn't said that in years. Not since a man named, well, that's another story. I told her I was glad. I asked a few questions. What did he do exactly? Where was he from? Did he have family nearby? She said he was from Charlotte originally, had moved around a lot for work, and that his parents were both gone. She said he was kind and attentive and brought flowers without being asked. I said all the right things. I was happy for her. I meant it mostly. They dated for 11 months. I met him for the first time at Thanksgiving, here at my house in Charleston. He brought a good bottle of wine and complimented the crown molding in the hallway and asked intelligent questions about the history of the neighborhood. He helped clear the table without being asked. He told me he admired what I'd built over my career. He said, "Sir, your daughter talks about you constantly. She's so proud of you." I smiled and thanked him, and I watched his eyes go flat while he said it. Renata and I have a tradition. Every year, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, we sit on the back porch with coffee and talk honestly about the year. It started when she was in college and has never stopped. That Sunday, after Callum had driven back to Charlotte, she asked me what I thought. I said he seemed like a capable man. She looked at me over her coffee cup. "She knows me too well. That's not a compliment coming from you," she said. "I didn't mean it as one," I said. Then I felt bad, because her face did something complicated, and I said, "Give me more time. I'm slow to warm up. You know that." She did know that. She let it go. But she'd heard what I hadn't said. They got engaged the following September. She called me from the restaurant, still at the table, voice shaking with happiness. He'd done it right. Asked her in private, no performance, no Instagram moment. She said, "Dad, I'm going to marry him." I told her I was happy. I asked if she was sure. She laughed and said, "Yes, Dad, I'm sure." I hung up and sat very still for a long time. The trouble started, specifically and concretely, about 3 weeks after the engagement. Renata called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. She sounded slightly off, not upset, more like she was choosing her words carefully. She said Callum had raised something with her, about finances, about the future, about finances, about the future, about, specifically, my estate. I own 3 properties. The house in Charleston, a rental duplex in Columbia, and a small commercial building I've held for 20 years that generates steady income. Beyond that, I have investment accounts and retirement funds that together represent a substantial sum. Renata is my only child and my sole heir. This is not a secret. Callum apparently had been asking her questions about it. Thoughtful questions, she called them. Forward-thinking. He had suggested, she said, that given how things were moving, it might make sense for her, and eventually him, to have some visibility into the structure of the estate, for planning purposes. I said, "What kind of visibility?" She hesitated. He mentioned being added to some of the accounts, not to control anything, just to be a named party, so there are complications later. I kept my voice completely level. I told her that estate planning was something I took very seriously, and that I'd want to speak with my attorney before making any changes. I told her that was just how I handled things, not a reflection on anyone. She seemed relieved, actually. I think part of her had been uncomfortable raising it. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down everything I knew about Callum Sutton on a yellow legal pad. His name, his supposed employer, the city he claimed to be from. His parents were deceased. No siblings mentioned. Moved around for work. I stared at the list for a while. Then I called my attorney, a man named Baxter Rohe, who I've worked with for 22 years. I told him what Renata had told me. There was a pause on his end. He said, "Fred, don't change a single thing on any document until we talk in person." We met the next day. Baxter said what I already knew. If Callum was named on certain accounts before a marriage and then the marriage dissolved, or even if certain transfers happened after marriage in a community property context, things could become complicated very quickly. He said the request, framed the way it had been framed, was either naive or strategic. He said, "Do you know which one it is?" I said I didn't. "Not yet." I started with the name. Callum Sutton, Charlotte, North Carolina, Investment Services. I'm not a private investigator and I know my limits, so I hired one. A woman named, I'll just call her my investigator, who came recommended by a colleague I'd worked with in commercial real estate for years. I told her what I needed. She told her what I needed. She told me she'd have something in 10 days. She had something in 6. The investment firm he named when he met Renata did not list a Callum Sutton anywhere on their website, their LinkedIn, or their public filings. She searched employment records and licensing databases. A Callum Sutton had held a Series 65 investment advisor license in North Carolina, but it had been revoked 4 years ago. She pulled the revocation notice. The reason cited was misrepresentation of credentials and undisclosed conflicts of interest in client dealings. She kept digging. The address he'd listed on the license renewal was an apartment in Charlotte that had been vacated 2 years ago. No forwarding address. She found a property record, a condominium purchased 18 months ago in Asheville, the same city where Renata taught school. The same city where he'd shown up at that fundraiser. I sat with that for a day. Then I asked her to find out who else he'd been around. Not romantically, professionally. Who he'd worked with, who had filed complaints, who might know his pattern. She found 2. A woman in Raleigh who had dated him briefly 4 years ago, right around the time his license was revoked, and whose family had lost a significant sum to an investment vehicle he'd recommended that turned out to be fictitious. The matter had been settled privately, which is why his name wasn't in any court records. And a man in Greenville, South Carolina, a widower in his late 60s, whose adult son had introduced Callum as a financial advisor. The widower had signed paperwork, making Callum a co-trustee of a small family trust. He'd discovered 6 months later that funds had been moved. The family had recovered most of it through litigation, but not all. I read that last part twice. A widower in his late 60s. A trust. A family that trusted him. I called Baxter again. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Fred, what are you going to do?" I said I wasn't sure yet. I wanted to know more before I decided. Renata was planning the wedding for the following April. They were doing it in Asheville, a venue outside the city, a renovated barn on a property with mountain views. She'd been to look at it twice and sent me photos. It was beautiful. She sounded so happy on the phone that I sometimes had to work very hard to keep my voice normal. She had also, around this time, started mentioning Callum's ideas more frequently. Small things. He thought she should look into refinancing the duplex in Columbia. He thought the commercial building might be worth selling given the market. He asked once, she told me casually, whether I'd ever considered restructuring things into a family LLC because the tax advantages were significant. Each time she mentioned one of these things, I said something neutral and changed the subject. I told no one what I was doing, not Renata, not my sister in Virginia, not any of my old colleagues. I went about my days normally. I had dinner with Renata and Callum twice during this period. I asked him about his work, and he spoke fluently and confidently about market trends and client portfolios. He was good. He was very, very good. He looked me in the eye and I looked back and we were both pretending. And I think on some level he knew it, and I think he decided I was just a careful old man who'd come around eventually. He was half right. The wedding rehearsal was scheduled for a Friday evening in April at a restaurant in downtown Asheville. The ceremony was the next afternoon. Renata had asked me to come up Thursday to help with a few things, and I did. I stayed at a hotel about a mile from the venue. Thursday night, I had dinner alone and thought carefully about what I was going to do. I had the documentation. I had a thick folder that my investigator had assembled. The license revocation, the complaint from the Raleigh family, the records from the Greenville situation, copies of public filings, a timeline. I had spoken with Baxter 3 more times. I had made certain that my estate documents were ironclad, that no changes had been made, that every account was properly structured and titled. Baxter had done a thorough review. Nothing had been compromised. What I hadn't done was tell Renata. I had lain awake over that for weeks. The arguments for telling her immediately were obvious. She deserved to know. She was a grown woman. It wasn't my place to manage her life. And yet, the arguments for waiting were harder to articulate but felt important. I didn't have every piece. I didn't know exactly how far his plans extended. I didn't know if confronting him early would cause him to find ways to muddy the waters, to turn her against me before I could show her clearly what was real. I was afraid of losing her trust in the process of trying to protect her. Eleanor would have known the right answer immediately. I did not have Eleanor. I decided to wait for the rehearsal dinner. The Friday evening event was held in a private dining room at a restaurant on Lexington Avenue. About 30 people, immediate family, wedding party, closest friends. Renata was radiant. She wore a green dress and her hair down, and she laughed at everything, and held Callum's arm and looked at him the way her mother used to look at me in the early years, with complete and uncomplicated faith. Callum was charming and relaxed. He made a toast that was genuinely funny. He put his hand on my shoulder at one point and said, "We're glad you made the trip, sir." And I said I wouldn't have missed it for anything. I sat through dinner. I ate. I talked to Renata's colleague, who was the maid of honor, a lively woman named, I'll just say she teaches 5th grade, and made me laugh twice. I talked to Callum's best man, a man I hadn't met before, who said he'd known Callum for about a year and a half since they'd crossed paths at a conference. I noted that detail quietly. Halfway through dessert, Renata leaned over and squeezed my hand under the table. Not a casual touch. The firm, deliberate grip she's used since she was a child when she's trying to get my attention without making a scene. I looked at her. Her smile was still in place, but her eyes were saying something different. She leaned close and said, very quietly, "Dad, I need to talk to you tonight." Something happened. I said, "When?" She said, "After dinner. Just us." Callum was 3 seats away, laughing at something someone had said. I said, "All right, sweetheart." The dinner wound down. People drifted toward the exit, saying their goodnights. I waited near the door. Callum went to use the restroom, and Renata appeared at my elbow and steered me gently toward a corner of the now emptying room. She said, "Dad, I found something today. On his laptop." I wasn't snooping. He left it open on the kitchen table, and he'd gone out to get groceries, and I walked by and I saw my name on the screen. I waited. She said, "It was an email to someone I don't know, a man named some name I didn't recognize, and it was about your properties. He had listed them, Dad, all 3, with estimated values. He had a timeline." Her voice was very steady, the way it gets when she is working hard to stay steady. There was a line in the email that said, "Once the paperwork clears after the wedding, we should be able to move on the first transfer within 60 days. I looked at her for a moment. She said, "What does that mean, Dad? What does that mean, Dad? What paperwork? What transfer?" I said, "Come and sit down." We sat at a table that had been cleared in the corner of the room. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and I put mine over them. I told her I had something to tell her. I told her I had known something was wrong for a while. I told her I was sorry I hadn't told her sooner, and that I'd made that choice trying to protect her, and I understood if she was angry about it. Then I told her everything, slowly and completely, the concerns that had started when she told me about the account request, the investigator, the license revocation, the woman in Raleigh, the widower in Greenville, the timeline I'd built, the documents I had in a folder in my hotel room. She sat absolutely still while I talked. Her face didn't do much. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The best man. He's only known Callum a year and a half. He told you that?" "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly. "So there's no one here who's actually known him a long time." "His references were thin," I said. "That was one of the things my investigator noted." Another silence. Then she said, "He told me his college roommate couldn't make it. Scheduling conflict." She almost smiled, but it didn't reach anything. I should have wondered about that. She asked me to show her the folder. I told her it was at the hotel, and we could go now, or wait until morning. She said now. We told the remaining guests. She and I were stepping out for a bit, father-daughter tradition, which wasn't entirely a lie. Callum had come back from the restroom by then. He looked at us leaving together with an expression that flickered once, something calculating, gone before you could name it, and then he smiled and waved. In my hotel room, she read everything I had. She took about 40 minutes. I sat in the chair by the window and didn't say anything. At one point she stopped and pressed her fingers to her forehead and breathed deliberately for about 10 seconds. Then she kept reading. When she finished, she closed the folder and held it in her lap. She said, "I want to call the police." I said I thought that was the right decision. I told her that Baxter had already been in contact with a colleague who specialized in this kind of financial fraud, and that the documentation we had was sufficient to initiate a real investigation. I told her that the revocation records, combined with the Greenville situation, which had produced its own paper trail, and now the email she had seen on his laptop, added up to something that law enforcement would take seriously. She said, "Tonight?" I said we could wait until morning if she wanted to think. She said, "No, I don't want him to sleep in my apartment tonight, not knowing. I don't want another hour of that." I said I understood. She called the non-emergency line for Asheville police and explained the situation calmly and clearly. They sent someone within the hour. A detective, actually. They'd taken it seriously enough to send a detective rather than a patrol officer, which told me the name of the investment scheme he was using, or something like it, was already known to them. The detective sat with us for over an hour. She took the folder, photographed everything, and told Renata what the next steps would look like. She asked several pointed questions about the email on the laptop. She said she'd need Renata to make a formal statement and, if possible, to allow them access to the laptop, which was still in Renata's apartment where Callum was staying. Renata gave consent. Callum was at the apartment when the officers arrived. I don't know exactly what that looked like. Renata wasn't there. We were still at the hotel. She told me later that he'd called her immediately, 3 calls in a row, and that she hadn't answered. He'd left a voicemail. He'd sounded calm and confused and told her there was some kind of misunderstanding. He'd used the word misunderstanding 4 times, she said. The wedding didn't happen. In the weeks after, Renata was not destroyed, but gutted in the way that a person is when something they believed in completely turns out to have been a construction. She grieved it the way you grieve a real thing, because it had been real to her. That's not nothing. I didn't try to minimize it. I sat with her on the phone most nights for the first 2 weeks. Sometimes we didn't say much. She'd grown up watching me handle loss by going quiet and doing the next necessary thing, and she had the same instinct. She told me once, about a month after, I keep thinking about when I was reading those files. I kept looking for something that would explain it differently. Some version where he had a reason. I said, that's not a flaw in you. She said, I know. It's just exhausting. The investigation proceeded. There were, it turned out, 2 other women in 2 other states whose situations were at various stages of the same pattern. The Financial Crimes Unit in Asheville coordinated with a task force that had already been building a case, Callum Sutton. Whether or not that was his legal name remained unclear for some time. Was arrested in May, 8 weeks after the wedding that didn't happen. The charges were significant. Renata took her students on a field trip to the botanical garden in June. She sent me a picture from it. She's in the back of a group of 9-year-olds, all of them squinting into the sun, and she's laughing at something, genuinely laughing, and she looks like Eleanor, and she looks fine. I printed the photo and put it on the refrigerator. I think about that moment at the rehearsal dinner sometimes, her hand squeezing mine under the table, the quiet grip that meant she needed me without wanting to say so in public. I think about how close it came. If she hadn't walked past that laptop, if he'd been more careful, if she'd been a woman who looked the other way because the alternative was too painful to face. But she's Eleanor's daughter, and she's mine, and she walked past that laptop, and she read what was on the screen, and she told me the truth. That evening when we sat in my hotel room and she closed the folder and looked up at me, she said something I've been turning over ever since. She said, you knew, and you waited. Why didn't you just tell me? I said what I said earlier, that I was afraid of getting it wrong. Afraid she wouldn't believe me. Afraid of being the overprotective father who'd cost her something real. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, Dad, I've always believed you. You just had to give me the chance. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, entirely. What I know is this. If you are wealthy, and you are aging, and you have children who love openly and trust easily, there are people who study that combination the way a carpenter studies wood grain. They are patient. They are charming. They do not look like what they are until you have been watching very carefully for a very long time. Run the background check. Hire someone if you have to. Lock your documents and know what they say. And when someone you love squeezes your hand in a quiet room and tells you something is wrong, don't wait another minute, because they're usually right, and the hour you spend confirming it is an hour you won't get back. I still have the yellow legal pad, the one where I wrote down everything I knew about Callum Sutton on that first night. It's in the top drawer of my desk. I don't know exactly why I kept it. Maybe because Eleanor always said I see everything and say nothing, and that night I finally wrote it down, and then I did something about it. That's enough, I think. That's more than enough. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you've carried in your pocket for years, and the thing that stays with me isn't the fraud, or the investigation, or even the arrest. It's that moment at the dinner table when Renata squeezed my hand. That quiet, deliberate grip. She knew something was wrong before she could name it. She'd felt it. And instead of talking herself out of it, the way so many of us do, the way I've done plenty of times in my life, she held on to that feeling until she could hand it to someone she trusted. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, really. I've thought a lot about what made Callum possible, and the honest answer is that he was possible because he understood something about good people, that they extend trust the way they'd want to receive it. Renata trusted him because that's who she is. That's how Eleanor raised her. And a man like Callum looks at a woman like that and sees not a person but an opening. He spent months building a version of himself that fit exactly into the shape of what she needed. The flowers without being asked, the help clearing the table, the toast that was genuinely funny. None of it was accidental. It was crafted. And the craft was good, which is why it worked as long as it did. What stopped it wasn't luck. It was three things. And I've thought about this carefully enough that I'm willing to name them. The first was that Renata trusted her own instincts enough to act on what she saw. She didn't dismiss that email. She didn't tell herself there was probably an explanation. She walked out of that apartment, and she told me the truth, even though the truth was going to cost her something she'd wanted badly. The second was that I had done the work before the crisis arrived. I didn't wait for the wedding to start asking questions. I didn't assume that because everyone else liked him, my discomfort was just an old man's stubbornness. I hired someone. I called Baxter. I made sure the documents were clean. The groundwork I laid over those quiet months is what gave us options at the rehearsal dinner instead of chaos. And the third, and this is the one I think about most, is that when she squeezed my hand, I was there, not performing, not distracted, just present, watching, already carrying everything I needed to help her. Intelligence without action is just worry, and action without action is just noise. What I've learned, at 67, after Eleanor and after everything, is that protecting the people you love requires all three in the right order. The discipline to pay attention before anything goes wrong, the wisdom to move carefully when something does, and the courage to tell the truth, even when it's going to hurt. Renata didn't need me to fix her life. She needed me to be ready when she was. That's the job. It's always been the job. She's fine now. Better than fine, on most days. And I still have that yellow legal pad in my desk drawer. I keep it there to remind myself that the quiet, careful work, the kind nobody sees, is often the only thing standing between the people you love and the ones who studied them from a distance, waiting. Pay attention. Do the work before you need it. And when someone reaches for your hand in a crowded room, hold on.